I want to begin with a prelude, what we can call 3 waves of evolutionary thought. The first wave is the one we all know about, and we learn about in college, that evolution is a theory that organizes the biological sciences. The second wave is that evolution is a theory that can explain the human condition. And I really think that we're lucky to be alive at this point in history, and that historians will look back and they'll see this century as a period of coalescing for all things human, our knowledge of all things human, in the same way that the 20th century was a period of coalescence for the rest of life, the biological sciences. And then the third wave is evolution is a theory that can improve the human condition. I think the reason that physics and chemistry are accepted more than evolution is not because they're supported by more facts, but because they're so useful. We just can't live without them in our everyday lives. And I think the same is true for evolutionary theory. And we'll also look back and we'll be asking the question, how did we survive so long without evolutionary theory as a practical toolkit for improving the quality of our lives? And I'll try to convey a little bit of all of those things during my talk. Well, what is this great theory that is so transformative and can be used to explain so much? Nico Tinbergen is famous among evolutionists. He won the Nobel Prize, one of the fathers of ethology. He wrote a classic paper in which he framed 4 questions that need to be asked to fully understand any particular trait. Number 1, what is its function, if any? Why does this trait exist compared to the many other traits that could exist, often based upon its contribution to survival and reproduction? 2, what is the physical mechanism that causes the organism to behave as it does or to act as it does? That's called proximate causation. 3, how did the mature traits of an organism develop in the history of the individual? And 4, how did this evolve in the history of the lineage? And for cultural evolution, that is the actual human history of the trait. That is the quickest way that I know to convey evolution as a theoretical framework that can be applied to virtually all subjects. And we're here today to train this framework on the topic of compassion and altruism. These are the standard definitions. Compassion is a deep awareness of the suffering of others, coupled with the wish to relieve it. Altruism is concern for the welfare of others, even at the expense of oneself. And so what does it mean to approach these topics from an integrated evolutionary perspective? Okay, going through the 4 questions. One question we need to ask about compassion and altruism is, how can these traits, if we just think of them as traits like any other trait, how can they evolve and survive in a Darwinian world, basically? How can the traits that we associate with compassion and altruism, how can they cause the individuals that have them to survive and reproduce compared to individuals who have alternative traits? Then our mechanistic question is, what are the psychological mechanisms that cause a person or other species, because this is definitely going to be trans-specific, to behave in a way that we regard as compassionately and altruistically? Then for development, how does the psychology of altruism and compassion develop during the lifetime of an individual? Is it something that must be learned early, for example, or can it be learned at any time? How specific are the mechanisms? So there's a whole suite of questions that could be asked there. And then the phylogenetic question. Do these things exist in other species? And if they exist for the same ultimate reason, do they also exist for the same proximate and developmental reasons? And not only do we need to ask this question for different species, but we need to ask this question for different cultures. And one of the new things about evolution is taking cultural evolution seriously, so seriously that different cultures are sufficiently different so that the mechanism that underlies pro-social behavior, including altruism and compassion, can be different for different cultures in the same way that it can be different for different species. Taking cultural evolution seriously means that there might not be such a thing as a universal human nature. Every culture might have a nature in some sense. So let's begin with the ultimate question, and here's where my expertise comes in. Altruism and compassion are a famous evolutionary puzzle for reasons that I think are familiar to most of you, natural selection straightforwardly favors traits that cause individuals to survive and reproduce better than other individuals. But the special thing about the traits motivated by compassion and altruism is that they motivate you to do good things for other individuals, often at the expense of yourself. And so if you put a polar bear with thick fur next to a polar bear with thin fur, the one with thick fur straightforwardly survives and reproduces better. It is locally advantageous. If you put an altruist next to a selfish individual, the altruist does not survive and reproduce better than the selfish individual in its immediate vicinity. Quite the contrary. And so the puzzle is, how can we get something to evolve in the total population when it is not locally advantageous? How can you get something that's less fit at the local scale to actually evolve in the total population? It is a puzzle, but a puzzle with a simple solution, at least a partial solution, which is that groups of individuals that behave compassionately and altruistically should robustly survive and reproduce better than groups of more self-oriented individuals. And so if we add a layer to the natural selection process, then we can see that natural selection at the group level can favor social adaptations, even when those same adaptations are selectively disadvantageous within groups. Now, why is this solution only partial? For a number of reasons. First of all, between-group selection must not only exist, but be sufficiently strong to outweigh within-group selection. Number two, this mechanism only explains compassion and altruism within groups. And so it leaves open the troubling possibility that compassion and altruism within groups might evolve to be directed against other groups. Of course, we know that this is something that happens. And so if we want our theory to be explanatory, it should make this prediction. But it's also a problem that we want to be able to solve, and we'd like our theory to have the resources to solve this. And then it also suggests that compassion and altruism evolves only insofar as they contribute to the function of groups. There's a sense in which compassion and altruism are not primary virtues. The only reason we might want them is because they cause human thriving in some sense. And it's possible that although they contribute to this, they might be necessary but not sufficient, in which we're going to need to go beyond compassion and altruism in order to build the kind of world that we would want to do as compassionate and altruistic individuals. So the necessary but not sufficient aspects of compassion and altruism is something that I want to address in this talk. Okay, enough theory. It's time for a reality check, and I'm going to tell you a story about compassion and altruism in an unexpected place. Water striders, and this is work done by my former student Omar Eldakar. Water striders, as many of you know, are these marvelous insects that skate on the surface of water. They're predators. Those colors are paint marks to recognize them as individuals. That's not part of the insect. And it turns out that water striders, males, vary enormously in their aggressiveness towards females. Some behave as sexual predators, and they're simply on the hunt for females wherever they go. And other males are gentlemen who basically wait to be asked to perform their manly duty. And these individual differences are quite stable in individuals, and so we can ask the evolutionary question, why do they coexist? How do these individual differences coexist in nature? And in one experiment, Omar very simply created experimental pools, and each pool had 6 males and 6 females, and he varied the composition of males from all psychopaths to all gentlemen and all the mixes in between. And so we want to know what happened, and in particular, how successful were the males? And the answer is that within every pool containing both types, the psychopaths always beat the gentleman. There was no local advantage to being a gentleman in any of the pools. And so this is now becoming something very similar to our famous puzzle, the same puzzle that we need to solve for compassion and altruism, as we might think of it in human terms. We need to solve for these water striders. So how can we get the gentlemen to evolve when they're selectively disadvantageous within all groups? The answer is that the group in which all the males were gentlemen were 3 times more productive than the groups in which all the males were psychopaths. Basically, the psychopaths terrorized the females. They couldn't feed. They just, and so they couldn't lay eggs. And so there was an enormous group-level advantage favoring the gentlemen that might potentially counterbalance the within-group advantage favoring the psychopaths. And when you add it all up, the net effect of both of these, you end up with this relationship between male aggressiveness and mating success. And we can see it's a hump-shaped curve, something which is keeping the individual differences in the population. And so between-group selection doesn't totally trump within-group selection, but it trumps it enough to keep individual differences in the population. So the take-home messages here are that nice traits can evolve in nature despite being vulnerable to nasty traits in their immediate vicinity. This is one of dozens and dozens of empirical examples that I could give you. And you know, a lot of these examples come from our domesticated animals. The chickens that give us eggs and the pigs that give us meat. If you were to select the most productive individuals, you would be selecting the most aggressive individuals. And what actually happens in the animal husbandry industry is that group selection is performed to get the animals, the hens and the pigs that give us that are gentle and docile and can live in groups without being aggressive to each other. And so these traits evolve only by virtue of a selective advantage at a larger scale, and a clustering mechanism is required for between-group selection to prevail against within-group selection. This is actually an experiment I've yet to describe of Omar's. In that first experiment, he created the variation among groups. But in a second experiment, he created an open population in which the individuals could freely move between the groups. And what he discovered was that the females, whenever they encountered a psychopath, they just left. And although the psychopaths were free to move also, the whole thing settled down in a distribution in which enough of the females were clustered around the docile, the gentleman males, so that they created the clustering. The movement of individuals created the clustering. And this is a very important mechanism in humans as well. So the clustering was based on conditional movement. In other examples, the clustering is caused for other reasons. Interactions among kin, for example. Or conditional behaviors without moving. So if you're mean to me, I don't move, but I just change my behavior, so I'm mean back to you. That creates a kind of a behavioral clustering. So it's the clustering that's important. And in this case, the end result is a mix of nice and nasty individuals. If that sounds a little bit like humans, then of course it is. Okay, well here's reality check number 2. Let's go through the same exercise in real-world human populations. That third wave that I was talking about, what I've been doing for the last 5 years through the Evolution Institute and the Binghamton Neighborhood Project, is to take some of these ideas and see if we can understand these kinds of dynamics in real-world populations with my former graduate student, Dan O'Brien here. And one of the things we did was simply measure traits that are relevant to compassion and altruism in humans. So we've done this in a number of ways. This is a survey. These questions are completely straightforward, asking individuals. These are asking public school students. These straightforward, communitarian, other-oriented question. And although we might want to argue about whether these count as compassionate and altruistic, at the very least they qualify as pro-social. And I think it's useful to have quite a broad term, pro-social, of any other and society-oriented attitude or behavior, regardless of whether it counts as altruistic or cooperative, and regardless of what the approximate internal mechanism is. Well, our data included, well, there's our individual differences. It's a bell-shaped curve, of course, it always is. And part of our data included residential locations, so that this is a map of Binghamton, New York, and all of those points is where all of those students live. And based on the magic of geographical information systems, we can generate a topographical map such as this. Don't look at the points, look at the dark hills and the light valleys, which are hills and valleys of prosociality. These are not geographical hills and valleys, but hills and valleys of prosociality. The way this is generated is by a mechanism called kriging. And with kriging, you take any point on the landscape and you generate a hypothetical value based on the surrounding points. And so you can take a scatter of points and you can turn that into a continuous circle. The points on this map are the locations of churches. And over the last few years, actually, we're very actively studying all of the nearly 100 religious congregations in Binghamton, something called the Binghamton Religion and Spirituality Project, which studies these things as they're practiced in the context of everyday life. But what we see here is an impressive degree of spatial clustering in prosocial behavior. So we do analysis, and aren't you lucky that I'm not going to describe this in detail? I'm just going to give you some take-home messages here. So, message number one, there is a strong correlation between the prosociality of the individual and the prosociality of the individual's environment. Those that give are most likely to receive. And this is the basic requirement for prosociality to succeed as an evolutionary strategy for humans no less than for water striders. And in fact, this correlation is so great that when we think of it just in terms of clustering, the degree of clustering is even greater than you would expect based on interactions among full siblings in a strictly genetic model. So if you think of Hamilton's rule and the coefficient of relatedness in a strictly genetic model, 0.5 signifies interactions among full siblings, and the correlation coefficient for kids in the city of Binghamton is 0.7. And so this is telling us, why are we such a cooperative species? It's because we have the ability to cluster as well as we do. And that clustering is not just genetic relatedness, it's for other reasons. And this is the first time that this kind of clustering has been measured in a real-world human population, the size of a city. Well, let's think about how people get this way. And there's ample evidence based on attachment theory and much else that there's early childhood effects, sometimes very early childhood effects, sometimes even before birth can influence your life history strategy, including your degree of prosociality. The spectrum of possibilities for phenotypic plasticity, of course, first of all, we have genetic differences too, which is a possibility. Then for phenotypically plastic mechanisms, it can be everything from early effects, which are irreversible, something happens early in life and then that sets the course, to the chameleon-like ability to toggle back and forth between phenotypes at the moment. Okay? That full range is possible. And what our research is showing is that adolescents have an impressive degree of resiliency, so that even though someone who's grown up in a tough environment and themselves are not prosocial, then actually if you change their environment, they can become prosocial, even in the adolescent stage of the life cycle. And we're also demonstrating the chameleon-like ability of all of us to calibrate our degree of prosociality to our immediate environments based on assessing our environments. I'll give you just a little bit of this information. So we do this survey longitudinally, and so that means we have information on the same kids at 3-year intervals. And during that period, a fraction of them have moved location within the city of Binghamton. Some have moved up a hill of prosociality, others have moved down a hill of prosociality. And we can ask the question, did they change their own prosociality based on the change in their environment? And the answer is that they do. That's a statistical effect. And then for extremely short-term effects, Dan did a photograph study in which he took photographs of the neighborhoods of Binghamton, and he showed them to college students who knew very little about the city, and he asked them to estimate the neighborhood quality based on the photographs. And then he compared that to the estimates of the kids actually living in those neighborhoods. Then in a second experiment, he showed the college students the photographs, and he had those college students play an experimental economics game, a cooperation game, with kids from those neighborhoods to see how they actually cooperated in a real-world game with real money at stake. And what this shows is that there's a lot of information in a photograph, that the college students accurately assess the quality of the neighborhood from the photographs, and they cooperated in direct proportion to the quality of the neighborhood. And so what this means is that we're always assessing our environment in the same way that we always assess our social partners as to whether they're cooperators or not, and we calibrate our behavior accordingly. We're always assessing our physical environment, and when we feel safe and secure, then we open up and we become cooperators. And when we feel threatened, then we pull into our shells and we become defectors. In some ways, this is obvious in retrospect, but it's really nice to show something like this experimentally. And of course, it leads to all kinds of possibilities in terms of what one might do. So now I want to address this interesting idea that compassion and altruism might be necessary but not sufficient for human thriving. And as we've seen, the evolutionary explanation for why these things can evolve is by virtue of causing groups to do better than other groups. We wouldn't want these things if it didn't cause groups to do well in general terms. And so if it's true that these are necessary but not sufficient, then we'd want to somehow assemble the full package, basically, not stop at altruism and compassion, but assemble the whole package. And something else in this package that's been well documented is social control. These are famous experiments by Ernst Fehr and Simone Gochter. These are experimental games that are played in the laboratory, and basically a group of people are brought in, they're giving some money, and they can either keep the money or they can contribute it to a central pot where it gets doubled and redistributed to everyone in the group. And in the first version of the experiment, people start out moderately generous, but then before long, as they play the game again and again with the same people, they realize some people are not being so generous, and so they're basically being exploited by members of their own group. And given the parameters of the game, the only way they can protect themselves is to withhold their own cooperation. And so in an afternoon, cooperation disappears like water draining from a bathtub. Then in the second version of the experiment, it's a new game. It's like the old game, except there's something else you can do with your money. You can put it in a second pot, and that money will be used to punish the individuals that don't cooperate. For every dollar you contribute, $3 is deducted from the earnings of the cheaters. And it turns out that some people, not everyone, but some people love to punish. It gives them joy to punish. And if you put them in an fMRI machine, they get pleasure, mental pleasure from punishing. And if enough individuals exist in the group, then you get the enforcement of cooperation, and cooperation goes to very high values. Well, all of this is very conciliant with the human social environment in which we evolved, which consisted of small groups, important shared objectives, and low-cost mechanisms of social control. So social control is very important in the history of our social psychology, and it has tremendous modern relevance. This is Elinor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for showing that groups of people are capable of managing their own affairs, but only if certain conditions are met. And she did this not only theoretically, but empirically by studying a worldwide database of groups that attempt to manage their common resources, such as farmers managing irrigation systems, fishermen managing their fisheries, foresters, and so on and so forth. And the design features that Ostrom identified for how these groups function well are very conciliant with the evolutionary dynamics of cooperation and the history of our species, the biocultural evolution of our species. So I'm going to show you the design features that make groups work empirically based on Lynn Ostrom's work and other work. And as we go down this list, I want you to ask yourself two things. First of all, these are all straightforward. There's no surprises here. But in the second place, how many groups do you know that don't have some of these design features? Groups do not automatically converge upon these design features. And another thing we can ask is, where's the compassion and altruism as we go down these design features? So one thing that successful groups tend to have is a strong group identity and a strong sense of purpose, what they're doing, what they're about, and that they are a group. The other thing that's important is proportional equivalent of costs and benefits. Actually, it cannot be the case. It is not sustainable for some individuals to do all the work and for other individuals to get all the benefits over the long term. Self-sacrificial altruism is very important in some situations, but it cannot be the daily operation. It's simply not sustainable. Those who give must get, and that proportionality must be established. Consensus decision-making. People hate being bossed around and being told what to do, but they will work hard to implement a consensus decision. Monitoring. Most people want to cooperate, but some don't. And there's always a temptation to slack. So unless you're monitoring good behavior, then forget about it. Graduated sanctions. If somebody does misbehave, then you need to not just bring the hammer down right away, but you need to remind them in a gentle fashion. That's typically enough to keep them in solid citizen mode. But then for the odd individual, you do need to be prepared to escalate. Fast, fair conflict resolution. If there's a problem, it needs to be resolved quickly and in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. For all of these things to happen, the group must have the elbow room to manage its own affairs. And that ingredient alone is so often lacking in modern day groups. And then in large-scale society, these groups have to be hooked together in a way that's coordinated among groups. A very important concept of polycentric governance. That any population has many spheres of activity. Each sphere of activity has an optimal scale. And that what governance is to find the optimal scale for each sphere of activity and then to appropriately coordinate among the spheres of activity. Anything else will be a suboptimal form of governance. Okay, well, here's a group of teenagers in my city of Binghamton. All except for this guy. He's the mayor of Binghamton. His name is Mayor Matt Ryan. This is actually a dance troupe that's formed, and I love showing this photograph because it shows the joy of us being in a small-scale group that's doing what it wants to do. This group is spontaneously formed. They're doing it their way. They're actually competing with other groups. They have dance battles with other groups. There's just utter joy on their faces. It's an ethnic rainbow. And so this is what can emerge spontaneously when the right conditions are met. But how can we unleash this kind of energy in a school program? Most of these kids are actually doing very poorly in school. And so I had the privilege of advising the Binghamton City School District to design a program for at-risk high school students informed by evolutionary science, and the results were just published in PLOS One only about 3 weeks ago. So now I had the opportunity to do some evolutionary social engineering, and here's what we did. We used the Ostrom principles, and so we tried to embody all of these principles as best we could. Another major set of considerations is the difference between a safe and secure and a threatening environment. So I'm sure many of you know about positive psychology, the work of people like Barbara Fredrickson, and how the mind works very differently in a threatening environment and a safe and secure environment. So unless you're feeling safe and playful and relaxed, then that's what you need to do. And then there's a set of considerations involving the nature of long-term learning and the fact that no organism learns anything when all the costs are in the near future and all the benefits are in the far future. This is a book by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and colleagues, who's best known for his work on flow. And what it is a longitudinal study of talented teenagers who were identified as talented in the 9th grade. And then he followed them through their high school careers, and he asked the question, how many of them were talented in the 12th grade? How many were fulfilling their gifts? And how many had simply become merely average? And the answer to the question was that the kids that had fulfilled their gifts, were fulfilling their gifts, were the ones who enjoyed what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. If you don't like it on a day-to-day basis, you're not going to be able to keep it up. And if that's true for the gifted end of the bell curve, just imagine what it's like for the at-risk end of the bell curve. And so we attempted to build all these features into our school. We also did a randomized control trial, so we had a good comparison group. And here are the results. The kids in this Regents Academy, their performance popped up like a cork within their first marking period. It didn't even take much time. You had this huge performance outcome in this new social environment compared to the normal high school routine. And at the end of the year, when they all took the state-mandated exams, we found that for 4 subjects, the Regents Academy students, not only did they do much, much better than their comparison group, but they performed on a par with the average high school student. And so what this is telling us is that the right kind of intervention can enable a kind of a phenotypic plasticity so that even kids who have led very difficult lives, their entire lives, and continue to lead difficult lives in the other aspects of their lives, are actually capable of responding to an environment that basically favors prosociality and these kinds of long-term learning outcomes as the successful Darwinian strategy. Just a few results from here from some non-academic improvements. Their well-being increased by a lot. Their family relations increased a lot. They like school not only better than the comparison group, but better than the average high school student. So this is basically a way that all students should be taught. And so there's much to say here about educational practice in general terms. So some take-home messages here is that when we look at where is the compassion and altruism in this particular school program, it is there. It's very important for this to be a nurturing, compassionate environment for the students. And so a lot of this was just earning the trust of the students and giving them hugs when they needed it. And so there's no question that altruism and compassion was a vital ingredient of this school. And the principal and teachers were definitely, in my book, altruistic in terms of their dedication and the work that they did on behalf of others for this program to work. But I think you can also see that the Regents Academy would not have worked without its other design features. And so if we want to build good social environments, then we need altruism, compassion, and more, I think, in most cases. This is a book that's just coming out. It's, I'm one of the co-authors, but Barbara Oakley is another one, called Pathological Altruism. There is a tendency to regard compassion and altruism as unambiguously good, as if everyone would benefit by becoming more compassionate and altruistic. And I think one of the things that evolution tells us is that just as these traits can be necessary but not sufficient, they can also be downright harmful to self and others under some circumstances. And so we have to be smart about when we employ compassion and altruism. There's really nothing in nature that's just plain good. Everything is against the background of the environment. And so we need to look at that relationship between the trait and the environment before we can decide whether these traits will be good. What are some of the pathological aspects of these things? One, of course, comes directly from multi-level selection. The general rule is that adaptation at any level in a multi-tier hierarchy requires a process of selection at the same level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. And so compassionate altruism at one level can become part of the problem at a higher level. This is actually a video game called Brothers in Arms, Hell's Highway. And what we see here is, of course, compassion and altruism at one level, and then terrible conflict at another level. And so we have to appreciate the multi-level nature of these traits, and we have to acknowledge that warfare and other forms of between-group conflict have been a major context for compassion and altruism throughout the history of our species. That does not mean that it need continue in the future, not by any means, but it is something that we need to appreciate to understand the nature of these traits in our species. And these traits can also be harmful for the individual when they're in the wrong environment. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine that you are a compassionate and altruistic individual, but unfortunately for you, you were placed in an environment in which everyone around you is not compassionate and altruistic and are bent on exploiting you. What can you do? And as far as I can tell, there's only 4 options. You can leave. You can try to get the others to be more compassionate and altruistic. You can turn off your compassion and altruism protectively, or you can continue to be compassionate and altruistic and suffer the circumstances. And when we look at the individuals who are in these valleys, some of them are actually social predators. They would behave the same way that they would even if they were going to peak, because that would just be, they're really set on that strategy. But most of them are individuals who are perfectly capable of behaving prosocially, but they have protectively, at some point in their lives, they have turned off their prosociality in order to protect themselves, because they're not in an environment in which that can be a successful trait. And so as we try to increase compassion and altruism, we have to do it not only at the individual level to encourage individuals to become more compassionate and altruism, but we also must create the social environment so that that succeeds as a evolutionary strategy. When you look at the Ostrom principles, what you find is that what they do is it provides an environment in which altruism and compassion can thrive as an evolutionary strategy. And without that environment, then the group falls apart, including those strategies. And so now I want to turn to proximate explanations. I want to make a few basic points. When we look across species, all the different social species in nature that behave cooperatively, we find a unity of explanation in terms of ultimate causation. All these forms of sociality basically evolved by group selection, prevailing against within group selection. But there's a diversity of explanation in terms of proximate causation. The genes and the physiological mechanisms and the psychological mechanisms that cause these very different species to behave as prosocially as they do, of course, are very different from each other. And we expect that because, after all, they're different species. Even species as close as wasps and bees have very different mechanisms that cause them to behave as prosocially as they do. So what's interesting is that the same concept of a unity of explanation at the level of ultimate causation and a diversity of explanation at the level of proximate causation can also exist among human cultures. This is a wonderful article that appeared now several years ago, which makes the point, and a point that needs to be made in general terms, that cultural diversity is like biological diversity. The diversity of cultures, of human cultures, is fundamentally like biological diversity. And so that means that when we study the degree to which different cultures are prosocial, and especially the mechanisms that causes them to be prosocial, we should expect to find diversity. And one research program that shows this very well is that of Joseph Henrich and his colleagues. This is the famous 15 societies study that I know a lot of you are probably familiar with. And once again, they're based on these experimental economics games that have become such a great toolkit for studying social behavior. In the dictator game, one person is given an endowment and is simply allowed to share it as he or she sees fit, no strings attached. In the ultimatum game, the second person is allowed to accept or refuse the offer, and if refuses, then nobody gets anything. And the reason that this research was so stunning to economists was that the economical prediction was that for the second person, anything is better than nothing, and knowing this, the first person should give as little as possible. So if you're a utility maximizer, that is the expected result. But real people didn't do that. Real people had a sense of fairness, which would cause them to refuse stingy offers. At least that was the result in weird cultures. That's another gifted term from Joseph Henrich, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic populations. And then the next thing that happened was that these games started to be played in small-scale societies around the world. And what was discovered was that there was much more variation than anyone expected. Some cultures seemed to approach the predictions of Homo economicus. Other cultures were scrupulously fair, and still other cultures exhibited seemingly perverse outcomes, such as people offering more than 50% of their endowment and that offer being refused. So how does that work? And so we had to bring ethnographers in, anthropologists who knew the deep structure of these cultures, in order to interpret how is it that this one game, the scientists methodologically so rigorous, will do the same experiment in all of these cultures, how this one game was refracted through the lenses of all of these different cultures to produce different outcomes. And so in the case of the perverse outcome, often gifts as a form of social dominance, that if you give somebody a gift, that's basically saying, I'm above you, and if you don't want to accept that, then you say, take your gift back, you're not dominant to me. That was the way they came in to the game. And another result was that, paradoxically it seems, although it makes sense in retrospect, is that the cultures that had, the more a culture had experience in Western-style market economies, the more cooperative, the more a sense of fairness that they had. And what you begin to see here is that what market transactions are cooperative relationships among strangers. It's a context in which people who don't know each other for anything else get together, and that there's a economic transfer. And for people that were accustomed to doing that kind of thing, when they play the game, they're kind of recognized as the appropriate frame, and then that's what they think in terms of. And so what this means is that the cultural lifeways of any particular culture makes it different for how people cooperate, and the role of compassion and altruism among the proximate mechanisms. So if you're in this culture, this amazing culture, a whale hunting culture, where they have to cooperate like crazy in order just to subsist, or this culture, a slash and burn agriculture in which the unit of cooperation is really close to the nuclear family. They have no context for cooperating with anyone else, and so when you cause them to do it in an experimental economic game, it's just like, they don't scarcely know what to do. To this kind of culture in which economic transactions are commonplace. Okay, well, what I want to do is I want to repeat and summarize what I've attempted to do in this talk. First of all, I've talked about 3 waves of evolutionary thought and how this theory, which we know has integrated the biological sciences, can do the same for the human condition, and can provide a practical toolkit for improving the human condition. In the quickest way I know how, I've tried to describe what it means to study anything from an integrated evolutionary perspective. And then I tried to focus that integrated evolutionary framework on the topics of compassion and altruism. And then I've attempted to do that very briefly in the time that I've had with you today, to show what, in my opinion, is a fully rounded research program for the study of altruism and compassion. And so thank you very much.
Actually, that was quite fascinating. And if you use the concept that she talked about, I can't remember her name, the Nobel Prize.
Eleanor Ostrom.
Ostrom. Number one, it seems straightforward. Number two, it's backed by scientific evidence. So why do our schools suck in general?
Yeah, and why do policies so often suck? And actually, well, they do. And I have a nice little parable in the Neighborhood Project in which I say that policies are like the wishes that people are granted in folk tales and end up regretting. Every policy has a surface logic, otherwise we would not be tempted to do them. And yet, so many policies have unforeseen consequences, just like the wishes in folk tales. But unlike the wishes in folk tales, where the character typically realizes their mistake, the unforeseen consequences of our policies are typically so diffuse and so indirect that we never actually connect them to their causes. And so it makes sense, for example, that we should, if we're not learning the 3 R's, then we should cut back on play and sports and the so-called extra. It makes sense to segregate children by age, and it turns out that that is pathological from the standpoint of any small-scale human society. In hunter-gatherer society, the kids learn from older kids. And you cut that off. It makes sense to implement a no-touch rule to avoid sexual harassment, when touch, as you know as well as anyone, is such a vital way to communicate trust and belonging. And so in this way, we become lost in a maze of unforeseen consequences. And that's true not only for education, but just about every policy issue that you might imagine. So that's why things suck. And a theory helps. Another reason why things suck is that we have our silos, and we all know about the fragmentation of knowledge, basically. We have all of these disciplines that are poorly integrated, and what that means is that even when something works, it does not spread beyond its disciplinary boundaries. And so the world is full of practices that work but don't spread, and practices that don't work but do spread. Another problem is called evolutionary mismatch, and that the adaptations, which work very well in the context of an ancestral environment, and that's especially a small group environment, don't work. They